Knife crimes and razor gangs have been a presence on the streets of Glasgow for nearly 200 years.
In 2002, the World Health Organization declared Scotland as one of the bloodiest nations in the Western world, and Glasgow, the murder capital of Europe.
Picture this: a quiet Glasgow street disrupted by the sudden fall of the city's most notorious gangster. Who's behind it, and what led to this shocking event? As we dive into Glasgow's underworld, we'll uncover a world where loyalty comes at a deadly price, and even the most powerful figures can tumble from their thrones. Get ready to explore the gritty reality of Glasgow's criminal underbelly, where every corner holds a secret and every alliance could be your last. The bell rings, and Gary Moore steps into the boxing ring, his fists clenched tight. The young fighter's eyes gleam with intensity as he faces his opponent. Moore's early years were shaped by discipline and violence, excelling in martial arts and boxing. His coach praised his lightning-fast reflexes and knockout power, but whispers began to circulate about his activities outside the ring. While Moore's days were filled with grueling training sessions, rumors swirled about his nights. Some said he was running with a rough crowd. Others whispered about brutal beatings in dark alleys. As Moore's reputation grew, so did his involvement in Glasgow's criminal underworld. The city's streets were a battleground for rival gangs, each vying for control of lucrative territories. Glasgow's criminal hierarchy was complex, with various factions competing for power. At the top sat the old guard, seasoned criminals who'd been running the show for decades. Below them were the up-and-comers, ambitious young thugs looking to make a name for themselves. Moore found himself caught between these worlds, his fighting skills making him valuable to both. The anticipation builds as we approach Moore's first major crime. What would push him over the edge from rumored tough guy to full-fledged criminal? The answer came in a shocking display of violence that would cement Moore's reputation in Glasgow's underworld. It happened on a rainy night in the east end of Glasgow. A rival gang had been encroaching on territory controlled by one of Moore's associates. Moore stormed into a local pub, fists and feet flying with deadly precision. When the dust settled, 3 men were hospitalized, and everyone knew who was responsible. As word of Moore's brutality spread, his rise through the criminal ranks was meteoric. Crime bosses fought to have him on their side, knowing his reputation alone could deter rivals. Moore embraced his new role, leaving behind any pretense of a legitimate fighting career. The young boxer who once dreamed of championship belts now set his sights on a different prize: control of Glasgow's criminal empire. As we follow Moore's ascent, we'll see how the skills he honed in the ring would be put to use in the brutal world of organized crime. But even as Moore's power grew, so did the number of enemies gunning for his position. The stage was set for a reign of terror that would grip Glasgow for years to come. What dark deeds awaited as Moore climbed to the top of the criminal ladder? And who would be brave or foolish enough to stand in his way? Moore's climb to the top of Glasgow's underworld was about to take a dark turn. In a quiet neighborhood, 6 innocent lives were snuffed out in a blaze that would expose the true brutality of the ice cream wars. As the flames rose higher, so did the questions. Who could commit such an unthinkable act, and was Moore behind it all? The Doyle family had no idea they were about to become caught in the crossfire of this brutal turf war. On a chilly April night in 1984, as the city slept, their world erupted in flames. Petrol was poured through the letterbox of their top-floor flat and set ablaze, trapping the family inside. The inferno spread with terrifying speed, leaving no chance for escape. The toll was devastating: 6 lives lost in an instant, including children. As news of the tragedy spread, Glasgow reeled in shock. This wasn't just another gang hit. It was a line crossed that left even hardened criminals shaken. As the embers cooled, the hunt for justice began. Police swarmed the area, desperate for leads. The community, once tight-lipped about underworld activities, now clamored for answers. Who could commit such a heinous act, and why target an innocent family? Initial investigations led to the arrests of Thomas T.C. Campbell and Joe Steele. The two men were convicted and sentenced to life in prison for the murders.
Joe Steele and Thomas Campbell have kept up a spirited campaign protesting their innocence. But after today's ruling, they're back in prison.
But even as they languished behind bars, whispers persisted that the real culprits were still at large. Moore's name kept surfacing in hushed conversations. Some claimed he was directly involved, others that he ordered the hit. Moore found himself charged in connection with the killings, but was cleared due to insufficient evidence. For 18 long years, Campbell and Steele proclaimed their innocence from prison cells. Their persistence paid off in 2004 when their convictions were sensationally quashed. The court heard claims of police corruption and fabricated evidence. Once again, the question loomed: if not them, then who? Years later, as Moore lay on his deathbed, he reportedly made a shocking confession, claiming responsibility for the Doyle family murders. But even this wasn't without controversy. Moore's partner told a different story, insisting it was his cousin Gordon Nash who was truly responsible for the arson attack. The Doyle family tragedy marked a turning point in Glasgow's underworld. The sheer brutality of the act sent shockwaves through criminal circles and galvanized law enforcement. As we leave behind the ashes of that fateful night, we find a Glasgow forever changed. The stage was set for a reign of terror that would grip the city for years to come, with Moore at its epicenter. Gary Moore's reputation as Glasgow's most feared enforcer was built on a foundation of violence and cunning. His ability to evade law enforcement became legendary, always staying one step ahead of the police. Moore relied on a vast network of informants and safe houses scattered across the city, vanishing like a ghost when cornered. The wall of silence surrounding Moore was impenetrable. Witnesses would suddenly develop amnesia when questioned about his activities, their lips sealed by a potent mixture of loyalty and fear. His connections within the criminal network were extensive, forging alliances with notorious figures like Ricky Taylor. As Moore's notoriety grew, so did the anticipation of a major confrontation. The tension in Glasgow's criminal underworld was palpable, with everyone wondering when and where Moore would strike next, or who would be brave enough to move against him. One incident solidified Moore's fearsome reputation. Brian Anderson, a street photographer, found himself face-to-face with Moore's unpredictable nature during a photo shoot. Anderson recounted a scene of utter chaos, with Moore brandishing a loaded Magnum revolver, high on a cocktail of alcohol and drugs. "It was unbelievable," Anderson recalled, describing bottles of vodka strewn about and Moore's erratic behavior. This encounter, while terrifying for Anderson, only enhanced Moore's image as an untouchable force in Glasgow's underworld. But Moore wasn't content to rest on his laurels. The scope of his criminal activities was about to expand, pushing the boundaries of what even the most hardened gangsters thought possible. Glasgow's underworld was entering a new era of violence and intimidation, with Gary Moore at its dark heart. What happens when a man like Moore decides to extend his reach? Join us as we explore the next chapter in his criminal career, where the stakes are higher and the consequences more brutal than ever before. Just as Moore thought he was untouchable, a single body found in a park threatened to bring his entire world crashing down. The death of Diane McInally in Glasgow's Pollock Park on October 15, 1991, sent shockwaves through the city's criminal underworld. Moore's name quickly surfaced in connection with the crime, along with his associate Dale Clark. The streets buzzed with speculation. Had Moore finally gone too far? As detectives dug into the case, they faced an uphill battle. Despite strong suspicions surrounding Moore and Clark, hard evidence proved frustratingly elusive. The criminal underworld closed ranks, with potential witnesses suddenly developing convenient cases of amnesia. Moore's reputation for violence preceded him, and few were willing to risk crossing the notorious gangster. But while the investigation stalled, Diane's family refused to give up their quest for justice. Her son, Craig, became a vocal advocate for his mother. "I would like to give the men responsible for Mum's death and could hide him for what they put her through," Craig stated, his words tinged with grief and determination. Theories about the motive behind McInally's murder began to emerge. Some believed she had witnessed another crime, perhaps even another murder, and was silenced to prevent her from going to the police. The idea that Diane might have been killed simply for knowing too much sent a chill through Glasgow's streets. In a bitter blow to Diane's family and those seeking justice, the case against Moore and Clark was ultimately dropped due to insufficient evidence. The decision sent shockwaves through Glasgow, with many seeing it as yet another example of Moore's seeming invincibility. How could a man linked to so much violence continue to evade consequences? As the dust settled on the McInally case, Moore's reputation took on a new dimension. Even hardened criminals were forced to reassess their relationships with him. Was partnering with Moore worth the risk of such extreme violence? Some of his former associates began to distance themselves, wary of being caught up in the fallout. As we leave behind the unresolved tragedy of Diane McInally's murder, we find Glasgow's underworld in a state of flux. Moore's position at the top of the criminal hierarchy was more precarious than ever before. The whispers that had long followed him had grown into a deafening roar. But as pressure mounted from all sides, Moore was about to face a new challenge, one that would push him to his limits and set the stage for his ultimate downfall. As Moore's grip on Glasgow's underworld began to slip, one man dared to get closer than anyone had before. Brian Anderson, a seasoned street photographer, scored the assignment of a lifetime in 2004. For 3 days, he would shadow Gary Moore, capturing the notorious gangster's life around Glasgow. Little did Anderson know he was about to embark on the most harrowing shoot of his career. From the moment Anderson arrived at Moore's flat, it was clear this wasn't going to be an ordinary photo session. The scene that greeted him was one of utter chaos. Bottles of vodka littered the floor, a testament to Moore's hard-living lifestyle. The air was thick with tension and the unmistakable scent of danger. As Anderson set up his equipment, Moore's erratic behavior became increasingly apparent. The gangster was flying high, his mood swinging wildly from moment to moment. The situation took a terrifying turn when Moore produced a loaded Magnum revolver. In broad daylight, right in the heart of George Square, the gangster began waving the weapon around, expressing a twisted desire to shoot pigeons. Anderson's heart raced as he realized the very real danger he was in. "I was ducking all the time as I was taking the pictures in case his gun went off," he later recalled, the fear still evident in his voice. Despite his terror, Anderson continued to snap away, his professional instincts kicking in even as his survival instincts screamed at him to run. For 3 days, Anderson walked a tightrope between capturing compelling images and preserving his own life. Every sudden movement from Moore sent a jolt of adrenaline through the photographer's body. The loaded gun never seemed to leave Moore's hand, a constant reminder of how quickly things could turn deadly. Against all odds, Anderson managed to complete the shoot. As he packed up his equipment for the final time, a wave of relief washed over him. He had done it. He had stared into the abyss of Glasgow's underworld and come out the other side with his life and his photographs intact. Years later, Anderson would describe it as the scariest incident of his career, a testament to the raw danger that surrounded Moore. The photographs he captured during those 3 days would go on to be featured in his online magazine, Glasgow Eyes, providing a rare glimpse into the life of one of the city's most feared criminals. As Anderson's encounter with Moore faded into memory, it left behind crucial insights into the gangster's psyche. The stage was set for a final act that would shake Glasgow's underworld to its very core. Moore's reign of terror was about to take a shocking turn, plunging Glasgow's criminal underworld into chaos. What happens when the son of a notorious gangster crosses paths with a man on the edge? The answer would leave even hardened criminals reeling. Jimmy Doyle, once Glasgow's most feared enforcer turned sculptor and author, had long left his criminal past behind. But his son James was about to ignite a powder keg that would expose the dark underbelly of gangland loyalties. The stage was set for a deadly confrontation, with Gary Moore at its center. Moore's volatile relationship with Janice, his former partner and mother of his daughter Lisa, added fuel to an already explosive situation. James Doyle had become romantically involved with Janice, creating a tangled web of emotions that would soon unravel with devastating consequences. On a seemingly ordinary weekend, Moore was granted leave from prison. He made his way to Janice's home, where James Doyle was staying. The atmosphere crackled with unspoken threats and barely contained rage. Suddenly, the situation spiraled out of control. Moore, in a fit of anger, grabbed a potato knife from the kitchen. James, realizing the danger, tried to flee. In a heart-stopping moment, Moore gave chase, pursuing James down the stairs. With a final, brutal thrust, Moore plunged the knife into James Doyle's chest, striking him directly in the heart. Despite the grievous wound, James staggered into the backyard, desperately clinging to life. But it was too late. Within moments, he collapsed, his life slipping away on the cold ground. As police sirens wailed in the distance, Moore began to craft his version of events, claiming self-defense. But as investigators combed the scene, no weapon was found on James Doyle's body. Moore's story began to unravel, exposing the brutal truth of what had transpired. The trial that followed laid bare the violent underpinnings of Glasgow's criminal world. Despite Moore's attempts to justify his actions, the evidence was damning. Gary Moore was convicted of culpable homicide and sentenced to 8 years in prison for the killing of James Doyle. The fallout from James Doyle's death sent shockwaves through Glasgow's underworld. The landscape of the criminal scene shifted, exposing the fragile nature of loyalty in a world built on fear and intimidation. For Gary Moore, the countdown to his ultimate downfall had begun, set in motion by a family feud that had turned deadly. The steel doors of HM Prison Barlinnie slammed shut behind Gary Moore, Glasgow's most violent gangster. His arrival sends shockwaves through the prison population. Inmates and staff watch warily as he takes his first steps into his new home. Moore's reputation precedes him, and everyone wonders, what happens when a man who terrorized the streets is thrown into a cage with hundreds of other criminals? From the start, Moore struggles to adapt to prison life. The rigid routines and constant surveillance chafe against his need for control. But it doesn't take long for his true nature to emerge. In one brutal confrontation with other inmates, Moore showcases his inability, or unwillingness, to play by the rules. This outburst cements his status as a force to be reckoned with behind bars. Despite his violent tendencies, Moore manages to carve out a unique position for himself. He participates in various programs, including self-defense classes, which he cleverly leverages to maintain his influence. This strategic move allows him to build a network of allies and informants, keeping him one step ahead of both rival inmates and prison authorities. As months turn into years, whispers begin to circulate about a change in Moore. the once volatile gangster speaks of finding religion and seeking redemption. To the surprise of many, Moore manages to sway the probation service to release him 6 months early, citing his newfound faith as evidence of his rehabilitation. But not everyone buys Moore's apparent transformation. Prison staff and fellow inmates view his religious conversion with deep skepticism. One guard remarks, "It's hard to believe that someone with his history could suddenly find God. We've seen inmates find religion just to get an early release." As Moore's release date approaches, tension within the prison reaches a fever pitch. Some inmates see his impending freedom as a betrayal, while others fear what he might do once he's back on the streets. In his final weeks, Moore throws himself into preparation for life outside, attending counseling sessions and job training programs. On the day of his release, Gary Moore steps out of HM Prison Barlinnie with a Bible in hand and claims of a new purpose on his lips. But the question on everyone's mind remains: is this truly a story of redemption, or just another chapter in the twisted tale of Glasgow's most notorious gangster? What do you think will happen when Moore returns to the world he once terrorized? Gary Moore stepped out of Barlinnie prison clutching a Bible, a stark contrast to the fearsome gangster who once terrorized Glasgow's streets. As he walked free, the city held its breath. Would this infamous criminal's newfound faith lead to redemption, or was it just another ploy? Moore's release stirred a mix of hope and doubt. He painted himself as a changed man, ready to make amends for his violent past. But not everyone bought his story. His former criminal associates, law enforcement, and the families of his victims all viewed his transformation with suspicion. As Moore tried to rejoin society, he faced roadblocks at every turn. His own daughter, frightened by his notorious reputation, kept her distance. This rejection from his flesh and blood must have stung, even for a hardened man like Moore. Despite widespread skepticism, Moore pushed on with his efforts to portray himself as reformed. He spoke about his new faith and desire to right his wrongs. But even as he preached redemption, rumors swirled that all wasn't as it seemed. People spotted Moore hanging out with known criminals soon after his release. These sightings raised questions. Was he truly committed to leaving his criminal past behind, or just biding his time? The truth, as it often is, probably fell somewhere in the middle. Moore's partner, Anne, later contested his deathbed confession about the Doyle family fire, claiming it was his cousin who was responsible. This contradiction hinted that even in his final moments, Moore's relationship with the truth remained complicated. As Moore's unlikely crusade for redemption unfolded, Glasgow watched with fascination and dread. The city had seen its share of criminal redemption stories, but none quite like this. Moore's life after prison was a constant tug-of-war between his professed beliefs and the violent reality of his past. In the end, Moore's attempts at reformation would be cut short in a way that seemed almost fitting for a man with his violent history. As we move to the final chapter of Gary Moore's life, we're left wondering, was his quest for redemption real, or just another act in Glasgow's brutal underworld drama? Gary Moore's return to the criminal underworld set the stage for a deadly game of cat and mouse on the streets of Glasgow. Despite maintaining a facade of reformation, Moore's actions spoke louder than his words. Reports circulated of his involvement with known criminals, and the streets buzzed with rumors of his illicit activities. It seemed the lure of power and easy money was too strong for Moore to resist. As summer 2018 drew to a close, tension in Glasgow's criminal underworld reached a fever pitch. Moore received an Osmond warning from the police, signaling his life was in danger. A significant debt owed to a local crime group had put a target on his back. But Moore, believing himself untouchable, continued to move about the city. On September 6, 2018, Moore's luck ran out. In a swift and merciless attack, a hooded assailant emerged from a vehicle and fired 9 bullets into Moore's head and neck outside his own home. The streets he once ruled had exacted their final revenge. As Moore clung to life, the investigation into his shooting began to unravel a complex web of violence and retribution. Police connected the attack to a series of violent incidents in Glasgow's underworld, suggesting a pattern of targeted hits linked to organized crime. In his final moments, Moore allegedly made a shocking confession, claiming responsibility for the Doyle family murders. But even this deathbed revelation was contested by his partner, Anne, who insisted it was Moore's cousin, Gordon Nash, who was truly responsible. As news of Moore's shooting and subsequent death spread through Glasgow, reactions were mixed. Detective Superintendent Andrew Patrick summed up the sentiment of many when he commented on the futility of the gangland feuds that had defined Moore's life and ultimately led to his downfall. Moore's violent end served as a grim reminder of the senseless nature of such crime, leaving many in the community reflecting on the consequences of this lifestyle. The question now was, would Moore's demise mark the end of an era, or was it just another chapter in Glasgow's ongoing battle with organized crime? Gary Moore's death sent shockwaves through Glasgow's criminal underworld, sparking a surge of violence as rival gangs rushed to fill the power vacuum. The city found itself grappling with the complex legacy of its most notorious gangster as fear and relief battled for dominance in the streets. Within months of Moore's demise, an unprecedented wave of targeted attacks swept through Glasgow. Detective Superintendent Andrew Patrick summed up the chaos. These serious incidents were challenging inquiries to work on individually. The violence involved in each of these cases is absolutely senseless. His words painted a grim picture of the brutal power struggle erupting in Moore's absence. As news spread, victims' families wrestled with conflicting emotions. Some felt a sense of justice, while others recognized that Moore's death did little to heal their deep wounds. The cycle of violence that had defined Glasgow streets for so long showed no signs of slowing down, even with the loss of its most infamous figure. One of Moore's former associates offered a nuanced perspective. He was a menace on the streets, and some will be happy to see him go. But of course, with all deaths, there are bereaved families on both sides. This view highlighted the complex impact Moore had on the city, acknowledging both the fear he inspired and the human cost of his violent life. In response to the escalating violence, law enforcement agencies in Glasgow intensified their efforts to combat organized crime. They adopted a more proactive approach, recognizing the opportunity to disrupt long-standing criminal networks exposed by Moore's death. The most significant posthumous revelation came in the form of Moore's deathbed confession, where he claimed responsibility for the Doyle family murders. This admission reignited public interest in the infamous ice cream wars, serving as a stark reminder of the long-lasting impact of Moore's crimes. As Glasgow continues to grapple with Moore's twisted legacy, his story has become a cautionary tale for the city. Law enforcement, community leaders, and policymakers now face the challenge of addressing not just the symptoms of criminal activity, but its root causes. The question remains, will the lessons learned from Moore's reign of terror lead to lasting change, or will his legacy continue to cast a long shadow over the streets he once ruled? Gary Moore's brutal reign and violent demise left a lasting impact on Glasgow's criminal landscape. The allure of power and easy money proved too tempting for many, but the consequences were severe. Even after Moore's death, the city continues to grapple with the aftermath of his actions. Glasgow's ongoing battle against organized crime remains a complex challenge. Law enforcement has stepped up efforts to dismantle criminal networks, but the deep-rooted issues persist. Moore's story serves as a stark reminder of the urgent need for comprehensive solutions that address the root causes of crime. As the city moves forward, it faces the daunting task of breaking the cycle of violence and creating a safer future for its residents.